Hi, Derived Energy here, and the title of this video is, let me think of a good title, Child Smacking is Morally Problematic. And I wrote a dissertation in my psychology degree on child smacking, and I interviewed 4 parents, and I produced a transcript of those discussions I had with those parents. And then I performed a discourse analysis on the transcript in order to try to find contradictions in the way they presented themselves in relation to their child smacking behaviour. So I'm just going to read one of the one of the analysis that I wrote concerning one of the parents I interviewed. So, without further ado, during the course of the interview with P2, that's what I refer to the parent as, there is noticeably a dramatic conflict between accounts that position her as an individual who is greatly concerned with the educational needs of her children, and accounts that present a picture of a woman who is greatly motivated by her own personal and more subjective needs as a person. When asked about how she conceives of her general role as a parent, she draws upon a discourse identified by Goff and Reevey, namely of that of an educator, a woman who has a responsibility to teach her children to have a good sense of what constitutes right and wrong. This rational and emotionally neutral identity she temporarily adopts, however, soon gives way to a more emotional presentation of herself when she is asked to define unacceptable behaviour. At this point, P2 portrays herself as a woman who is primarily concerned with wielding omnipotent control over her children. And she says, "I find it completely unacceptable when my children deliberately don't do what I say. I won't tolerate it." And whose perception of the unacceptability of her children's behaviour appears to be at least influentially shaped, if not wholly determined, by the persistency rather than the seriousness of the behaviour. Especially if I've told them over and over again to do it and they still don't listen. We have then a finding that lends credence to Anderson and Murray's contention that the persistence of a child's behaviour is a significant contributing factor to the level of stress a parent experiences in relation to her children. When asked about the ways in which P2 disciplines her children, she presents herself as a woman who is emotionally vulnerable during the administration of a quick smack. If they push their luck too much, I will lose my temper. However, this particular discourse, that is, of justifying physical punishment in terms of her own emotional state, is interestingly absent when P2 is asked to justify why she uses corporal punishment on her children. It is at this point that P2 once again slips into the guise of a teacher, greatly concerned about the moral development of her own children. They need to learn, and you have to do what's right for them. Further analysis of the interview transcript revealed that not only is there tension between accounts that stress the importance of the children's need to learn, and accounts that position P2's children as legitimate targets, both for the release of the parents' anger and frustration, and as a medium through which parents can obtain a feeling of omnipotent control over their children, but that also the latter discourse is greatly favoured over the former. P2's heavy reliance on discourses that justify smacking in terms of her own needs predominate the interview, but she does occasionally cite her children's misbehaviour in terms of the breaching of universal standards of right and wrong. They certainly don't repeat their bad behaviour in a hurry after I've made my feelings known. However, notice here that once again P2 has shifted her focus once again from the nature of the behaviour of her children to her own subjective emotional state, this time in mid-sentence. The point is, whereas P2 is prepared to describe her children's misbehaviour in terms of the breaching of morality, the same judgment is never made concerning her own smacking behaviour, it being justified primarily in terms of her mood and to a lesser extent the educational needs of the child. So we have yet another inconsistency here that was remarked upon by Goff and Reevey. It is interesting to analyse how P2 manages to discuss these issues without incriminating herself in terms of the immorality of her actions, given that her disciplinary methods appear to be heavily influenced by her mood. First of all, she repeatedly emphasises that smacking is a last resort, and then she gives them advance warning before they push their luck too much. In addition, she confesses to disliking smacking and stresses that her physical punishment is not extreme. I would never hit them hard. In addition, it is felt that P2 stresses her perceived demarcation between herself and her offspring. I'm the parent and they're the child, and that this facilitates the employment of double standards, allowing herself to feel anger and to behave accordingly, whilst labelling her son's behavioural transgressions as serious. To say that P2 has a positive evaluation of her own parents' disciplinary methods would, it is believed, involve neglecting the ambivalent nature of her discourse. Although she starts, when discussing the degree of competence her parents exhibited as disciplinarians, by asserting that they performed their role as disciplinarians competently, she expresses the view that her parents were a little heavy-handed, especially my mother. However, prior to disclosing this piece of information, she makes a self-deprecating remark about her own behaviour as a child. I wasn't the best behaved daughter in the world. That draws upon the pedagogic discourse outlined previously. This linguistic strategy can be seen to soften the subsequent remark made about her parents by focusing on the immoral conduct of her behaviour as a child, a technique that P2 uses successfully in relation to her own children. The same pattern is present when P2 discusses whether she believed her parents treated her fairly. She begins by claiming that they were in fact fair, and then she empathises with her parents concerning the patience testing aspect of parenting. It is only after she has claimed that her parents were fair and sympathised with the demands of being a parent that she begins to adopt a more critical stance concerning her fair upbringing. I didn't deserve to be smacked or smacked as hard as I was. I was only little and I didn't mean to be naughty. It is also felt that it is insightful to note that when discussing how she felt while she was being physically punished, she adopts the identity of a physically and mentally beleaguered victim who has no other option other than to just accept it, inciting emotive words such as upsetting, physically painful, angry, confusing, and unloved. I feel like a div doing this. It is at this point during the interview that no defence of her parents' behaviour is attempted, and her feelings are allowed to surface unconditionally. However, perhaps aware of the implications these feelings have for her parents and their disciplinary methods, P2 suddenly lurches into an account of the pleasant time she had as a child and stresses the attention her parents gave her. They were always there for me, and she talks of the parents' love she received as a child. This shift would have been noticeable under normal conditions, but it seems especially conspicuous given that the question that prompted her answer was directed solely at the feelings she expressed during the time she was physically chastised. Given the fragmented and ambivalent accounts that P2 provides, it is perhaps not surprising that there is much confusion in P2's discourse when discussing the impact her own childhood has had on her own attitudes concerning child smacking. When asked about the long-term efficacy of smacking in terms of modifying children's behaviour, P2 approves of its effectiveness by citing the positive impact she believes it has had on her own process towards becoming a responsible, unselfish adult. On this particular occasion, P2 seems to see herself and her attitudes as a product of the discipline she herself received, a view that she uses to support her own disciplinary practices. However, when asked explicitly whether her childhood has affected her as an adult regarding these issues, her response is much more ambivalent. and she makes considerable efforts to emphasize the discrepancies between her own parenting and that of her mothers and fathers. I'm not as physical with punishment as I think my mum and dad were. I've tried to be more reasonable. My parents, tended to smack me when, looking back, I think it was often uncalled for, and I would never do that to my own boys. This discourse allows her to present herself as an autonomous decision-maker, an individual who has consciously and independently come to her own conclusions regarding how to deal with her own children. P2's need to be seen this way is manifested further when she discusses the role the media has had on her own views. I think I would have to say it's up to the parents at the end of the day to make their own decisions about how to bring their own children up. However, this claim of autonomy is, as mentioned earlier, at times not substantiated elsewhere during the course of the interview, a finding also commented on by Anderson and Murray. For example, an illuminating parallel can be drawn, it is felt, between the positioning of her children as individuals who have to accept it, that is, being smacked as a result of disobedience, and her own lack of options as a child in dealing with the prospect of corporal punishment. It was quite confusing, but you just had to accept it. Okay.